July 20th, 1944, 12:37 p.m. The air inside Conference Room 2 at the Wolf's Lair burns thick with tobacco smoke and summer heat. Around the heavy oak table stand 24 officers, the men who command armies, who sign execution orders, who move divisions across maps like chess pieces. And among them, standing nearest to Adolf Hitler, a man with 3 fingers missing from his left hand and 2.2 pounds of British plastic explosive hidden in a leather briefcase, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. For 3 years, Allied intelligence had reported the same conclusion. Assassination was impossible. Hitler never kept to schedules. He changed routes without warning. He trusted no one. His security apparatus had foiled a dozen plots before they reached the planning stage. But that morning, at a small airfield outside Berlin, something different happened. Stauffenberg had armed the bomb. He had passed through 3 security checkpoints. And now, 5 minutes into the briefing on the Eastern Front, he quietly excused himself, placed the briefcase under the table, 18 inches from Hitler's legs, and walked out. What happens in the next 11 hours will become the closest anyone ever came to killing Adolf Hitler from within his own command structure. The most elaborately planned military coup in German history. An explosion that should have decapitated the Nazi regime, but instead exposed something far more chilling about the nature of dictatorship and the fragility of resistance. But more than that, it will demonstrate something the conspirators had never fully grasped, that killing a tyrant is the easy part. It's what comes after, the phone calls, the loyalty tests, the split-second decisions of confused officers, that determines whether revolutions succeed or collapse into firing squads. To understand why the July plot represented such a shock to both Hitler and history, you have to go back to how the German officer corps understood loyalty. For generations, perhaps since the Prussian military reforms of the 1800s, the German army had built its entire identity around a concept called Führertreue, absolute personal loyalty to the commander-in-chief. This wasn't just military discipline, it was wrapped up in an entire philosophy of honor, oath, and duty. Officers swore an oath not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to Hitler himself. Breaking that oath meant more than treason. It meant violating the sacred bond that defined what it meant to be a German soldier. The idea that senior officers, decorated veterans, men who had commanded armies and won Iron Crosses, would turn their weapons inward against their own Führer seemed not just unlikely, but philosophically impossible. This wasn't naivety. German counterintelligence was extensive and ruthless. The Gestapo knew in general terms that dissent existed. They had arrested communists, socialized, clergy, intellectuals. They knew some officers were uneasy about the war's direction. What they didn't fully appreciate, what they couldn't quite believe until the bomb went off, was the depth of the conspiracy. That men at the very center of power, chiefs of staff, field marshals, the head of military intelligence, had been planning this for over a year. That the plot wasn't coming from the margins, but from the core. From men who sat in the same rooms as Hitler, who briefed him daily, who had the access, the authority, and the operational expertise to actually pull it off. The conspirators had something the Allies never possessed: proximity. Every external assassination scheme, the British SOE plans, the Polish resistance fantasies, even the lone wolf attempts, foundered on the same problem. How do you get close enough? Hitler's security was layered. The SS Leibstandarte guarded the outer perimeter. The Führerbegleitkommando controlled the inner ring. Food tasters sampled every meal. Routes changed hourly. Public appearances were rare and unpredictable. But Stauffenberg didn't need to infiltrate. He was already inside. As Chief of Staff to the Reserve Army, he had legitimate reasons to attend high-level briefings. He had clearance. He had a reputation. A war hero, wounded in North Africa. a man who had sacrificed fingers and an eye for the Reich. No one suspected him because suspicion itself seemed absurd. And he had something else, Operation Valkyrie. This was the key that made everything possible. Valkyrie was an official Nazi contingency plan, designed to maintain order in case of internal uprising. Slave laborers, concentration camp revolts, communist cells. It authorized the reserve army to deploy troops, seize communications infrastructure, arrest SS personnel if necessary, and establish martial law. It was a protocol for protecting the regime from within. And Stauffenberg had quietly rewritten it, line by line, clause by clause, to destroy the regime instead. The orders looked official because they were official. The command structure was real. The authorization codes were genuine. All it needed was activation. And activation required one thing: Hitler's death. On the morning of July 20th, the plan had already survived a dozen points of failure. The bomb, 2 blocks of plastic explosive, had been smuggled into the Wolf's lair. The fuses, British-made time-delay detonators, were temperamental but functional. The briefing had been moved at the last minute from an underground bunker to an above-ground wooden hut. Less confined space, more chance of survival, but Stauffenberg adjusted. At 12:37 p.m., he entered the conference room. The bomb was armed. 10-minute delay. He had to place it, leave the room, and be far enough away to avoid suspicion when it exploded. He positioned the briefcase under the table, 18 inches from Hitler's legs. Proximity was everything. A shaped charge, directed upward, would tear through wood and flesh. No one at that range would survive. But conferences are fluid. Officers move. Someone, Colonel Heinz Brandt, found the briefcase in his way. He shifted it, just a few feet, just enough to place a heavy oak table leg between the bomb and Hitler. Stauffenberg, already outside, walking briskly toward the airfield, heard the explosion at 12:42 p.m. The blast shattered windows. Smoke poured from the hut. 4 men died instantly or would die from injuries within hours. But Hitler, bleeding from his eardrums, uniform shredded, hair singed, walked out. A table leg, a wooden support beam. That's what changed history. In Berlin, 400 miles away, the conspirators didn't know. General Friedrich Olbricht, coordinating from the Bendler block, received word. Explosion confirmed. He assumed success. He activated Valkyrie. Orders went out across Germany. Arrest all SS and Gestapo personnel. Secure communication centers. The Wehrmacht is taking control to restore order after an attempted SS coup against the Führer. For 3 hours, it worked. In Paris, military governor Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel arrested 1,200 SS officers. In Vienna, Wehrmacht units seized key buildings. In Berlin itself, troops surrounded government ministries. But then, the radio broadcast. 1:00 a.m. Hitler's voice, unmistakable and alive, announcing that he had survived a clique of criminal officers and would take ruthless revenge. The coup collapsed in real time. Officers who had followed orders suddenly realized they'd been part of treason. Some tore up the Valkyrie directives. Others switched sides immediately. In the Bendler block, loyalist officers arrested the conspirators, the very men who hours earlier had been giving them orders. By 11:00 p.m., Stauffenberg, Olbricht, and 2 others were executed by firing squad in the courtyard. No trial, no delay, just a brief confirmation of identity and then gunfire. The entire operation, planning, execution, collapse, lasted 11 hours. But here's where the story deepens. Because this wasn't just about a bomb, it wasn't just about killing Hitler, though that would have been extraordinary enough. What made the July plot truly significant, what made it a watershed moment in understanding totalitarianism, was what it revealed about the fundamental contradictions within the Nazi system, and how catastrophically fragile that system actually was. The regime had not been complacent. They had not been careless. They had built layers of security, cultivated fear, demanded absolute loyalty, and executed thousands for far less than what Stauffenberg attempted. What they didn't grasp, what they couldn't quite internalize until the bomb went off, was the magnitude of the disillusionment within their own ranks. This wasn't a conspiracy of outsiders. This wasn't communist resistance or Allied infiltration. This was the army, the institution Hitler had courted, empowered, and relied upon to conquer Europe. And that army, or at least a significant faction within it, had decided Hitler was not a leader but a liability, not a savior but a threat to Germany's survival. They failed to kill him, but they succeeded in shattering a myth that loyalty was absolute, that the system was unbreakable, that resistance required only external enemies to fear. After July 20th, Hitler trusted no one. His paranoia, already severe, became pathological. He purged the officer corps. 7,000 arrests, 5,000 executions, families destroyed, entire branches of the military leadership decapitated. But he could never again assume that the men standing beside him, saluting, following orders, he could never assume they believed. That's the legacy of the July plot. Not what it accomplished, but what it exposed. That even in the heart of tyranny, conscience can survive, and that survival, however brief, however doomed, is its own form of resistance. By the summer of 1944, the Third Reich, that had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Caucasus, was contracting like a dying star. In the West, Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy 6 weeks earlier. Entire German divisions were being encircled in France. In the East, the situation was catastrophic. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive, had obliterated Army Group Center. 28 divisions, 400,000 men, gone in 5 weeks. The maps in Hitler's war room told a story his proclamations refused to acknowledge. Germany was losing, not gradually, catastrophically. And deep inside the Wolf's Lair, his fortress headquarters buried in the forests of East Prussia, Adolf Hitler had become a ghost haunting his own regime. He no longer addressed the public. He avoided Berlin. His health was deteriorating. Tremors in his left hand, a shuffling gait, eyes that colleagues described as feverish and distant. He trusted no one, ate alone, kept irregular hours, changed schedules without warning. The man who had mesmerized millions now spent his days in a concrete bunker, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants, issuing orders for armies that no longer existed to defend positions that couldn't be held. But isolation breeds blind spots, and in those blind spots, a conspiracy was taking shape. They weren't radicals. They weren't ideologues driven by abstract principles. They were pragmatists, officers who had watched Hitler's strategic incompetence bleed Germany dry. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, Chief of Staff to the Reserve Army. Aristocrat, war hero, a man who had lost an eye, his right hand and 2 fingers from his left in North Africa. A devout Catholic who quoted Stefan George and believed Germany's soul was worth dying for. General Friedrich Olbricht, Deputy Commander of the Reserve Army, the logistical mind. The man who understood that revolutions succeed not through passion, but through paperwork, authorization codes, communication protocols, the bureaucratic machinery that keeps armies moving. General Ludwig Beck, former Chief of the General Staff, the moral center. He had resigned in 1938 over Hitler's reckless war planning. Now, in quiet meetings across Berlin, he represented what Germany might become after the tyrant fell. Colonel Henning von Treschow, Eastern Front veteran. The philosopher-soldier. He had tried twice before to kill Hitler. Once with a bomb disguised as brandy bottles on Hitler's plane. It failed to detonate. He tried again. Failed again. Each failure hardened his resolve. These men understood something the Gestapo refused to believe, that loyalty has limits, that oath-breaking in the service of a greater good might be the highest form of honor. Their plan hinged on a bureaucratic masterpiece, Operation Valkyrie. On paper, Valkyrie was a Nazi contingency protocol, designed to mobilize the reserve army if internal disorder threatened the regime. Slave labor uprisings, communist cells, SS power grabs. The orders authorized Wehrmacht commanders to deploy troops, seize communications infrastructure, arrest SS personnel, and establish martial law. It was meant to protect Hitler. Stauffenberg and Ulbricht had rewritten it, quietly, incrementally, buried in administrative revisions, to destroy him. The genius was its legitimacy. The orders bore official seals. The command structure was real. The authorization existed. All it required was activation. And activation required one condition: the Führer's death. What the conspirators were building wasn't just an assassination. It was a constitutional coup disguised as crisis management. A revolution hidden inside the regime's own emergency procedures. The irony was almost poetic. They would use Hitler's own paranoia, his obsession with control, his demand for contingency plans against every possible threat to dismantle everything he had built. But first, they had to kill him. And that meant getting close enough to a man who trusted no one, in a fortress designed to be impenetrable, on a day when luck and timing would have to align with millimeter precision. The clock was ticking. The Gestapo was closing in on fragments of the conspiracy. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Germany was running out of time. And so were they. Berlin, spring 1944. While the official war raged across Europe, another conflict unfolded in whispered conversations and folded notes passed between men in uniform. They met in apartments with curtains drawn, in churches during confession, in staff cars parked on anonymous streets. General Beck's home became a salon of treason. Officers arriving separately, leaving at intervals, never all present at once. The tradecraft was amateur but necessary. Coded telephone calls. The package is ready meant the bomb was armed. The weather has changed meant abort. They burned letters immediately after reading. They spoke in vague euphemisms even when alone, as if the walls themselves might testify. The fear wasn't abstract. The Gestapo had eyes everywhere. Secretaries who reported conversations, adjutants who noted unusual meetings, phone lines that clicked with the telltale sound of monitoring. One careless word could unravel everything. In June, the circle nearly broke. The Gestapo arrested a peripheral conspirator. For 3 days, the core group waited. Would he talk? Would midnight raids follow? Would they wake to SS officers at their doors? He didn't break. He was executed without naming names. But the warning was clear. They were operating on borrowed time, in borrowed spaces, trusting their lives to men they could never fully know. Klaus von Stauffenberg had not started as a revolutionary. 2 years earlier, he had been a rising star, brilliant staff officer, admired for his strategic mind, destined for high command. He believed in Germany. He believed in duty. He had, like so many, believed Hitler's promises could be separated from Hitler's methods. Then came North Africa. April 7, 1943. A British fighter strafed his staff car outside Tunis. Shrapnel tore through his body. He lost his right hand, his left eye, 2 fingers from his remaining hand. 3 months in hospitals, surgery after surgery, learning to write again, to dress himself, to function with a body that no longer obeyed him. But something else happened in those hospital beds. A reckoning. He had seen the war's true face, not the propaganda of heroic struggle, but the grinding waste of it, the pointless deaths, the strategic insanity of fighting on three fronts, the moral rot of a regime that demanded absolute loyalty while leading Germany toward annihilation. His faith deepened rather than collapsed. He read Stefan George's poetry, The Man, the Deed, and saw in it a call, not to passive resistance, not to quiet dissent, to action, violent, decisive, irreversible action. "I feel obliged to do something," he told his brother, Berthold. Not wanting to, obliged, as if conscience had become a military order he couldn't disobey. At home, his wife Nina was pregnant with their fifth child. 4 children already, sons and a daughter who called him Papa, who didn't understand why their father spent so much time away, why his eyes carried that distant, haunted look. He knew what failure meant. Not just for him. Execution was the merciful option. But for them. Nazi law was explicit. Sippenhaft. Blood guilt. The families of traitors shared their punishment. Wives sent to camps. Children stripped of names, scattered to orphanages, erased. Every time he kissed his children goodbye, he wondered if they would grow up knowing him as a father or as the man who destroyed their lives. Yet he moved forward, not despite the stakes, but because of them. In late-night conversations with fellow conspirators, Stauffenberg framed it in theological terms. Tyrannicide, the ancient doctrine that killing a tyrant isn't murder, but moral necessity. That some evils are so absolute that opposing them becomes sacred duty, even if opposition means damnation. Treschow put it more bluntly. The assassination must take place, coûte que coûte, whatever the cost. Even if it fails, we must prove to the world and to future generations that German resistance risked everything. Compared to that, nothing else matters. They weren't trying to save themselves. They were trying to save the idea that Germany had been worth saving. By July, the conspiracy had expanded to nearly 200 people, officers, diplomats, civil servants, each one a potential point of failure, each one carrying a secret that could kill them all. The bomb was ready. British plastic explosive, shaped and timed. Stauffenberg had access to Hitler. The Valkyrie orders were rewritten and waiting. In Paris, Vienna, Prague, officers stood before the signal. Everything was in place, everything except certainty. Because they all knew, Stauffenberg, Beck, Olbricht, every man in that shadow network, that they were crossing a threshold from which there was no return. That history would judge them either as saviors or as traitors, and the difference would come down to seconds and inches and the unknowable chaos of a bomb blast. On July 15th, Stauffenberg flew to the Wolf's Lair for a briefing. The bomb was in his briefcase. But Himmler wasn't present. The conspirators wanted to kill both. Stauffenberg didn't arm it. He flew back to Berlin. 5 days later, he would get one more chance. And this time, he wouldn't hesitate. The Wolf's Lair shimmers in midsummer heat. Concrete bunkers buried under camouflage netting. Guard towers. 3 security perimeters. At the center, a wooden conference hut. Conference Room 2, its windows open to catch the breeze. Stauffenberg's plane touches down at 10:15 a.m. He carries 2 briefcases. One holds documents. The other, 2.2 pounds of death. In an anteroom, hands shaking, his remaining 3 fingers fumbling. He arms the first bomb. The British pencil detonator. Acid eating through wire. 10 minutes once activated. He tries to arm the second block. An adjutant knocks. "Colonel?" "They're waiting." "1 bomb. It will have to be enough." 12:30 p.m. 24 officers crowd around the oak table. Hitler leans over a map of the Eastern Front, his back to the door. Stauffenberg enters, salutes, moves to his assigned position. Right side of the table. Close. Close enough. He sets the briefcase down, 18 inches from Hitler's legs. His heart hammers against his ribs. The fuse is burning, acid through wire. Minutes dissolving into seconds. He can't stay. If he stays, he dies. If he leaves too obviously, they'll suspect. "Excuse me, Führer. I need to take an urgent phone call from Berlin." Hitler waves him off without looking up. Stauffenberg walks, not too fast, not too slow, through the door, into the corridor, past guards who nod at the familiar face, outside into blinding sunlight. He's 200 meters away when the world tears itself apart. The explosion is a physical thing. Pressure wave, heat, sound collapsing into a single violent instant. The wooden hut disintegrates. Windows shatter outward. Smoke pours black and thick into the summer air. 4 men will die, 20 injured. Papers scatter like snow across the compound. From the airfield, Stauffenberg sees the smoke rising. His driver guns the engine. They speed past checkpoints, confusion working in their favor. Guards wave them through. No one knows yet what's happened. No one knows who to stop. In the air by 1:15 p.m., Stauffenberg allows himself to believe. Hitler is dead. It's done. The phone call reaches the Bendler block. Explosion confirmed. Multiple casualties. General Olbricht doesn't wait for confirmation. He can't. Delay means failure. He issues the code word, Valkyrie. Across Germany, teleprinters clatter to life. Wehrmacht units receive official orders on official letterhead with official authorization codes. The Führer is dead. A treacherous group within the SS has attempted a coup. The Wehrmacht is assuming executive power to restore order. Arrest all SS and Gestapo personnel immediately. In Paris, General von Stülpnagel moves within the hour. 1,200 SS officers arrested, headquarters seized. In Vienna, Prague, Munich, Wehrmacht commanders mobilize troops. The machine Stauffenberg designed is working. The regime is being dismantled from within, using its own protocols. At the Bendler block, the conspirators allow themselves cautious optimism. Reports flood in. Units responding. Arrests proceeding. The SS caught flat-footed. Beck already envisions the speech he'll give. Germany freed from tyranny. Peace negotiations with the Allies. A new government emerging from the ashes of the old. For 3 fragile hours, the impossible seems within reach. Then, at 6:28 p.m., a voice crackles over German radio. Unmistakable, unshaken, alive. Adolf Hitler. Inside Conference Room 2, the blast had been catastrophic. 4 men lay dead or dying. Shrapnel had shredded uniforms, embedded glass in flesh. The stenographer, legs blown off, would die that evening. But Hitler walked out, shaken, eardrums bleeding, uniform in tatters, hair singed, but alive. The reason was absurd in its simplicity. Colonel Heinz Brandt had found Stauffenberg's briefcase in his way. He'd shifted it, just a few feet. Just enough to place a heavy oak table leg, thick, solid, immovable, between the bomb and the Führer. The blast, shaped by confinement, had vented outward instead of up. The wooden hut's open windows dissipated the pressure. What should have been fatal became survivable. Chance. Furniture. Inches. That's what stood between Germany and a very different history. At 1 o'clock, Hitler is on the phone with Mussolini, voice steady, rage building. By 3 o'clock p.m., counter-orders are going out. The Führer is alive. Any orders claiming otherwise are treasonous. Arrest those who issued them. Stauffenberg lands in Berlin at 4:30 p.m., 3 hours late. Communications chaos had delayed him. He rushes to the Bendler block expecting triumph and finds paralysis. Officers are receiving contradictory orders. Wehrmacht units mobilized under Valkyrie are now being told to stand down. Commanders are calling Berlin asking, Which orders are real? And the answer, the fatal fracturing answer, is that no one knows. Loyalty, that ironclad concept the conspirators had tried to override, snaps back with vicious force. Officers who had followed Valkyrie orders an hour ago suddenly realize they've committed treason against a living Führer. Self-preservation kicks in. They tear up the directives, switch sides, start making phone calls to prove their loyalty was only temporarily confused. In Paris, Stülpnagel's arrested SS officers are quietly released. In Vienna, Wehrmacht units return to barracks. The coup evaporates like morning fog. By 7 p.m., the Bendler block is surrounded. Not by SS, they're still in disarray, but by loyalist Wehrmacht officers. The army turning on itself. Inside, the conspirators face their end game. Some want to flee. Some want to fight. Stauffenberg, exhausted and resolute, keeps issuing orders as if will alone could resurrect the coup. At 11 p.m., loyalist officers storm the command center. A brief, chaotic firefight. Stauffenberg is shot in the shoulder. Olbricht wounded. The resistance collapses in minutes. They're dragged to the courtyard. No trial, no delay. General Friedrich Fromm, who had known about the plot but stayed neutral, now desperate to prove his loyalty, convenes an impromptu court-martial. Guilty, all of them. Immediate execution. 12:10 a.m., July 21st. The courtyard lit by car headlights. 4 men lined against the wall. Stauffenberg goes last. His final words, shouted into the darkness, "Long live sacred Germany!" The firing squad executes him at 12:15 a.m., 11 hours and 33 minutes after the bomb went off. The entire operation, planning, explosion, coup, collapse, execution, lasted less than half a day. But Hitler's vengeance was only beginning. Over the next 8 months, nearly 7,000 people would be arrested. 5,000 executed. Show trials broadcast on radio. Conspirators hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, their deaths filmed for Hitler's viewing. Families destroyed under Sippenhaft. Stauffenberg's wife and children arrested. His brother executed. His extended family scattered. Entire branches of the military aristocracy erased. The message was clear and absolute. Resistance, even from within, even from the elite, would be met with extinction. But something else had been revealed. Something Hitler could never quite undo. The system wasn't invincible. Loyalty wasn't absolute. The army, his army, the institution he'd relied on to conquer Europe, had harbored men willing to kill him. After July 20th, Hitler trusted no one. And Germany, watching the purge unfold, understood that the regime was devouring itself from within. They died as they had lived. Soldiers to the end. In the courtyard of the Bendler block, under headlights that cast long shadows against bullet-scarred walls, 4 men faced the firing squad. Stauffenberg, Olbricht, his aide, Albrecht Meuertz, von Kirnheim, Stauffenberg's adjutant, Werner von Haeften. No blindfolds, no ceremony, just the mechanical efficiency of execution. Each man was given seconds to speak. Olbricht was silent, Haeften defiant. Stauffenberg's voice rang clear into the darkness. "Long live sacred Germany!" The rifles cracked. 4 bodies fell. By dawn, they were buried in a nearby cemetery, still in their uniforms, still carrying the insignia of the regime they'd tried to destroy. Within days, the Gestapo exhumed them, burned the bodies, and scattered the ashes, as if erasing their graves could erase what they'd attempted. But you can't burn away ideas, and you can't execute what they represented. The purge that followed was medieval in its scope and cruelty. The People's Court, presided over by the shrieking fanatic Roland Freisler, became a theater of humiliation. Defendants were denied belts and suspenders, forced to hold up their trousers while being screamed at, their trials filmed for propaganda. General Beck, too old to face the firing squad, was allowed to shoot himself. It took 2 attempts. The final shot was administered by an SS officer. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, the man who would have led the new Wehrmacht, was hanged with piano wire, slowly, suspended from a meat hook. His execution filmed for Hitler's private viewing. Over 8 months, 7,000 arrests, 5,000 executions. The Reich Security Main Office compiled lists, relatives, associates, anyone who'd ever shared a conversation with the conspirators. Entire families destroyed. Children taken from their mothers. Wives sent to concentration camps. The Stauffenberg name itself became a crime. His widow Nina imprisoned. Their 5 children scattered, stripped of their identity. Sippenhaft, blood guilt, the ancient barbarism resurrected for modern use. But here's what haunted Hitler in the months that followed. What kept him awake in his bunker, surrounded by SS guards he could no longer fully trust. The conspiracy hadn't come from the outside, not from communists or resistance cells or allied agents. It came from inside, from decorated officers, from men he'd promoted, from the aristocratic core of the army itself, his own generals, men who'd conquered France, who'd driven to the gates of Moscow, had decided he was the enemy. In private conversations, Hitler raged about traitors in uniform and the cowardice of the aristocracy. But the rage was covering something deeper: fear. Because if these men, these believers, these insiders, could turn against him, then loyalty was an illusion. Trust was impossible. The entire edifice of command and control rested on sand. After July 20th, Hitler stopped appearing at military briefings without bodyguards. He ate alone. He trusted no one with his schedule. The Führer, who had mesmerized millions, became a paranoid recluse, commanding phantom armies from a concrete tomb. They failed to kill Hitler. That's the historical fact. But they succeeded in something perhaps more important. They proved that Germany still had a conscience. That even in the heart of the machinery of death, even among officers who'd sworn oaths and followed orders and enabled atrocities, there were men who reached a limit, who said, "No more, not in my name, not for this." Their resistance was doomed. Their planning was flawed. Their execution, literally and figuratively, was imperfect. But their attempt shattered a myth that the Nazi regime desperately needed, that the German people were monolithic in their support, that opposition existed only at the margin, that the system was unbreakable. After July 20th, the world knew differently. And more importantly, Germans knew differently. Resistance was possible, even if it failed, even if it cost everything. History remembers victories. We build monuments to successful revolutions, celebrate liberation days, teach our children about the battles won and tyrants defeated. But sometimes, perhaps in the rarest and most important moments, it's the failures that define us. The July plot failed in every tactical sense. Hitler lived, the coup collapsed, the conspirators died. The war ground on for 9 more months, claiming millions more lives. By any strategic measure, Operation Valkyrie was a catastrophe. Yet here's the irony that haunted Hitler until his final days in the bunker. He survived. But something essential died in that explosion. The myth of invincibility, the carefully constructed image of the Führer as destiny's chosen instrument, shattered along with the windows of Conference Room 2. After July 20th, everyone knew he could be reached. He could be opposed. The system wasn't eternal. More than that, the conspiracy proved that moral courage could survive even in tyranny's deepest shadows. That men could choose conscience over oath. That resistance wasn't futile simply because it failed. Today, the Wolf's Lair lies in ruins. Concrete bunkers blown apart by retreating Germans in 1945. Forest reclaiming what was once the nerve center of conquest. The conference hut, rebuilt after the blast, destroyed in evacuation, exists now only in photographs and memory. There's a haunting silence to those ruins. A meditation on inches and seconds, on wooden table legs and last-minute room changes, on how close history came to a different turning. Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators didn't save Germany. They couldn't stop the Holocaust or prevent the war's final devastation, but they proved something perhaps more enduring, that even when darkness seems absolute, even when resistance appears doomed, the choice to act remains sacred. History often remembers victory, but sometimes it's the failures born of courage that define humanity's truest resistance.